Humpback whales coming to the surface. This comes from Life in the Freezer, one of the early series that I did on the Antarctic. And we were the first people to see this kind of behavior that we saw, this so-called bubble netting with whales in the Antarctic. It had been seen in the Arctic off Glacier Bay in Alaska, but we were the first ones to see it in the Antarctic. And basically, these humpback whales, when they find a cluster of krill or a cluster of fish, then two or more, or even single animals sometimes, they'll dive down and underneath the ball, underneath the shoal of fish, they swim round in a circle, slowly emitting bubbles from their blowhole in a steady stream. And the bubbles go up. And as the animal circles and comes up in a spiral, then the bubbles effectively form a curtain in the water, and the prey inside won't break through that bubble curtain. In fact, it tends to concentrate the prey ever tighter. So as the humpback swims up, slowly making circles around the prey, then squeezing the prey together, then eventually the prey gets pushed between the walls of bubbles, current walls, and the surface of the water. And at that point, the whale, right underneath, the whale will open its mouth and lunge up through the prey, through the water, and it just the nose of the whale breaks the surface as it comes up, the jaws close, and then it's engulfed a large amount of its prey. So bubble netting is a way to concentrate your prey, to make each mouthful more, contain more stuff. And sometimes two humpback whales will work together. They'll sometimes do spirals going round, coming up, and then together they come to the surface at the same time. And this is what you're seeing. You're seeing the rostrum and the lower jaw of this whale just coming and breaking the surface. And again, we filmed that for Life in the Freezer, and no one had seen them feeding like that before, although it has been seen more commonly since then. But you have to wonder whether, is this a technique that whales have to learn? And if they have to learn it, then do all of them necessarily learn it? Or is it just certain pods who stick together? Is it one of them who gets the technique and then passes it on to his or her generations? Or is it just random, let's say? Because it's not bubble netting is not something that you see all the time, but it is more common in some parts of the world than others. For example, you do it in Glacier Bay, a lot of Alaska. It might just be to do with the sort of concentrations of food that they're finding underneath the surface. If there's not enough food, then the bubble netting doesn't work. If the food is really tightly packed anyway, then maybe they don't need to bubble net to get it to pack together. So there's a certain prey density which will possibly initiate bubble netting behavior, but it's certainly very spectacular to watch, because when they come up, they take this enormous gulp of water and prey into their mouths, and then if you look at a whale normally when it's swimming, you'll see that underneath its jaw, it's actually quite folded, the skin. It's like pleats underneath the jaw. And when they take in that huge amount of prey and water, the underneath of the mouth just balloons up like a great big balloon. And that's because they've taken in all this water. And then the tongue comes up and the muscles contract, and the water and the food is strained out through the baleen. Baleen plates are how these animals feed. And the easiest way to describe baleen is if you take a toothbrush, a hairy toothbrush, and turn that, make a giant version, and turn it upside down and put the bristles in the top jaw instead of teeth. Then that's basically baleen feeding mechanism of a whale. So it swims through the water, and then when it lunges at prey, it traps all the prey inside its mouth. And then as the tongue comes up, the water gets pushed through the bristles, but the food is caught by the bristles, and then the tongue licks it off, swallows it, and the whole thing starts again. But it's very impressive bubble netting.
Have you, when you've been filming them back then, have you ever come across the same whales like years later?
Well, no, not years later, but you're right. Humpback whales can be identified mostly by the pattern of black and white on the underside of their tail fluke as they lift it up, and by the patterns and nicks along the tail. So yes, some areas they do have a very big catalogue pictures of whale tails, and they have made one or two matches over the year. I'm not sure if anyone's ever matched the killer whale. If anyone's ever matched a humpback tail in the Antarctic with a humpback tail somewhere else. I could be wrong. Maybe there was one that was off Colombia. In other words, they took a picture in the Antarctic and then found the same whale off the Colombian coast of South America, which is what you might expect. You know, they come to the Antarctic in the winter and then they migrate north they come to the Antarctic in the summer and then they migrate north for the winter. But I know they've made matches on that, and certainly not in the Antarctic. But when I filmed in Tonga, there were a smaller number of whales, let's say, but there were one or two whales in certain areas that we recognised their fins day after day after day. And we knew some of those recognisable whales were more or less friendly than others. And if we found a whale that we knew was friendly, then we knew we could spend a bit of time with that, get to know it again, go in the water, and we would get some good classy stuff. So yeah, you can recognise the same humpback whale from one day to the next, or possibly one place to the next.
And so with the rise in water temperatures, is that affecting their migration habits, or like?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much climate change is affecting big whales. To be honest, if you look around the world, the big whales are actually doing very well. With the cessation of whaling back in the 60s, 70s, and the whale numbers around the world generally, but particularly in the Antarctic, the whale numbers are going up. When I started going down the peninsula, killer whales and humpback whales were comparatively rare, certainly killer whales, but now the numbers have gone up massively. And that's partly because if you wipe out a whale population, you also take out all the knowledge that population has about where to go to feed. So if you let the population recover with animals coming in from outside, from other areas, then they need to learn, they need to find out where the food is. And so it takes them a while to recover, not just in numbers, but just recover in knowledge of where they know to go. And that's what we see in the Antarctic. There was the killer whales, for example, and the humpbacks. There was they took a hell of a pounding over 70, 80 years of whaling. And now the numbers are recovering, but they're also learning where to go every year to get the best of the feeding. And of course, whales are very mobile. They're not like penguins. If you take the prey of penguins and you shift the concentration of that prey 10 miles further away, then that might put it outside the foraging range of penguins. So that has a big effect on them. Whereas 10 miles to a whale in the open ocean or 10 miles to an albatross flying isn't really all that important. You know, they can scout around, they can find that prey even though it's moved. But with penguins, it's, perhaps harder. Although having said that, for albatross, it might be okay for albatross, to roam over the many miles, but it's not every bird that can glide and fly as far as an albatross. So some of the more cliff nesting birds, which have a shorter foraging range, if you take the prey further away, then you could be affecting their numbers quite a lot.
So the only threat whales mostly have is the odd random countries that still whale, and I guess engulfing microplastics.
Well, microplastics are a problem for an awful lot of animals, but particularly animals like, big baleen whales, which feed by moving through the water and filtering their prey from very large amounts of water. Then yes, if a whale's baleen is designed or evolved to pick up particularly small animals, then yes, they could be ingesting large amounts of plastic. So we might be talking about the right whales and the bowhead whales in the Arctic, the right whales off Patagonia. They don't lunge feed. They tend to swim much more slowly with their big mouth open, swimming slowly, letting the water pass through their baleen. So they would certainly be capable of filtering out microplastic particles. And again, we just don't know enough, about it. The danger is that rather like the atmosphere is being changed overall because of climate change. In some areas where we change the atmosphere, the impact, the effect can be much more clearly seen than others. We were doing the same to the sea, but it's less visible in a way.
Yeah.
Extra CO2 in the atmosphere goes into the water, which makes it more acidic. Extra melting of sea ice in the Arctic, possibly affecting the Gulf Stream, which is that huge major current that runs from west to east across the North Atlantic, which makes the UK climate as easygoing, as less extreme as it is. All these things could be being affected over the longish term. And by longish term, I mean 20 to 50, 75, 100 years, which is, sadly, is people can almost adapt to that. But I'm not sure if animals can. So it might be that we are seeing some whale species actually doing okay, but mostly because they're not being hunted so much. But whether the long-term effects of climate change will eventually catch up with them, will eventually change the ecology of the oceans such that it becomes unlivable for them, I don't know. That might be too far ahead. I mean, mammals, after all, are very adaptable, etc. But it's hard, isn't it? I mean, you might think that no way a whale is dependent on a coral reef. Well, it might well be somehow. We just haven't worked out the connections. So if we start nobbling coral reefs, then it has some eventual effect on the whales. I don't know. It's going to just take hard to do the predictions. We just have to keep an eye on things. And again, it just comes back to we got to control the problem. We've got to control CO2, climate change, because otherwise we are well, I was going to say unwittingly changing the planet. Well, we're not unwittingly doing it anymore because we know full well what's happening. So we can't claim ignorance as an excuse. We've